Order. Questions to the Secretary of State for Wales, Patricia Gibson.
Number 1, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The House will be aware that today is the 10th anniversary of the mining disaster in Ayrshire, in which Charles Breslin, David Powell, Philip Hill and Gary Jenkins lost their lives. I know that colleagues across the Chamber will join me in paying appropriate respect at this time and, of course, in sending condolences to their families. Mr Speaker, we've always been clear that the universal credit uplift was temporary to help people through the economic shock of the pandemic. We are committed to supporting families most in need and planning a long-term route out of poverty by helping people find work.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I echo the words of condolence from the Secretary of State. More than a third of all those who receive universal credit are in work and will now have to pay an extra £100 a year in NI contributions, whilst also suffering a cut of £1,040 per year, whilst UK inflation has risen to 3.2%, its highest increase since 1997. Will the Secretary of State use his influence to push for the publication of any impact assessment or analysis on the consequences of this cruel cut to universal credit, which research suggests will mean that 1 in 8 people will struggle to afford food?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I know that colleagues across the House have received representations from constituents and charities and other bodies on this subject, so it is one we take extremely seriously and rightly so. Of course, one of the things government is absolutely committed to rebalance is the economy, both local and national. We have, of course, the Plan for Jobs, Levelling Up Fund, Shared Prosperity Fund, Community Renewal Fund, a number of ways in which we're attempting to do that, which will help, of course, those who aren't in work, but also those people who are on in-work benefits too. So we are very conscious of the Honourable Lady's observations and, as I say, absolutely committed to making sure that every family, not just those out of work, are helped as best we possibly can.
Shadow Secretary of State Neil Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. Well, now, 250,000 of Welsh families now face the grim prospect of losing over £1,000 a year because of this government's shameful decision to slash universal credit. Now, we know that his colleague, the Shadow Work and Pension the Work and Pension Secretary, seems to think that people just need to work harder. But I would remind the Secretary of State that nearly 40% of Welsh people who receive this payment are in fact in work, many of them key workers. So what does the Secretary of State have to say to those families and their children who are struggling to make ends meet now and who will be so much worse off as a result of this cut?
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I touched on this obviously in the answer to the initial question, especially around the temporary nature of the increase and, of course, the many plans and projects we have which are going to enhance and improve the economy in Wales and which will have a positive effect on the very families that the Honourable Lady talks about. I think it is worth just pointing out as well that, of course, it is this government that increased the personal threshold on NICs. That was of considerable value to families across the land, and that there have been other improvements, things like the increase in national living wage. And I think those things need to be taken into account as well, and I'm sure the Honourable Lady will do that.
Neil Griffith.
Mr Speaker, that's going to be much comfort to those families that are going to be losing £80 a month. But Mr Speaker, this is not just a blow to Welsh families, but it's a real hit on Welsh shops and businesses, because we all know that families on low income have to spend their money locally on the very basics of life. So this will suck £286 million per year out of the Welsh economy. The party opposite constantly talks up about the sums paid to get this country out of the pandemic. But isn't the reality that the Tories are taking money away from Welsh businesses just at the time that so many of them need it most?
Well, I do fundamentally reject, Mr Speaker, that accusation. And having visited numerous companies, large and small, across Wales throughout the pandemic, the message that I've had back is one of relief that the UK Government Treasury has been able to step in and offer the levels of help that it has. But in particular relation to her comment about universal credit, what she's suggesting is that none of the remedial measures that we've introduced would work. That is clearly not the case. And so the families that she quite rightly, and other colleagues quite rightly raise as concerned about what the future holds, should, I hope, be reassured by the fact that the government continues to be committed not only to the companies but the individual families themselves.
Okay. Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The North Welsh coast, when you go from Wilver to Trawsfynydd to Capenhurst, is intimately connected with the northwest of England through Capenhurst, Warrington, all the way up to Sellafield Moorside. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that those economies work well together to solve problems in the nuclear industry, and that the Northwest Nuclear Arc is something that we should be very proud of?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and particularly because I've been on the receiving end of such compelling arguments by organisations like the Mersey Alliance, which recognise the economic region, the economic drivers, recognise that actually administrative boundaries can sometimes be an impediment to investment. And I absolutely share her enthusiasm and her confidence in what might be available in the future.
Can I just remind members, if there is supplementary, it's meant to be the original question that supplementary's got to be in line with. Let's come to Liv Saville-Roberts.
Very honourable about it. His government's attack on struggling families this autumn will make more than 4 in 10 families with children over £1,000 worse off. It's no surprise that he's content with plunging thousands of people into poverty. But these families, they spend their money in high street shops and local businesses. Government policy will be directly responsible for taking £286 million out of the Welsh economy. This isn't levelling up. This is hammering down. What assessment has he made of the effect of the universal credit £20 cut on the Welsh economy?
Well, the Honourable Lady clearly didn't listen to the answers I gave to the first and second questions on this very subject, and her statement, rather than her question, her statement is predicated on the basis that none, absolutely none of the other economic interventions that the government has been making, and we've talked about Plan for Jobs, Levelling Up funds and other encouraging initiatives. So she makes the assumption that none of those will have any positive effect at all. That is clearly incorrect. It's clearly not supported by businesses across Wales, and which leads me to only one conclusion, that she's determined to talk down the economic prospects of the country she wants to represent.
Liv Saville-Roberts.
The government is content that Wales loses almost £300 million. But the Internal Market Act, trade agreements, control of state aid, and now plans to cut Welsh MPs from 40 to 32. The pattern is clear. His government is taking from Wales and giving to Westminster. Anyone can see that levelling up will only happen when we have a strong Parliament in Wales that's empowered to do the job and directly answerable to the people of Wales. We all know there's a reshuffle going on. Is now the time to reshuffle the Wales office out of existence?
Well, Honourable Lady won't be surprised that I'm not going to rise to the last of the baits that she dangles in front of me. But I would say that she needs to make her mind up, actually, whether she wants Westminster representation or whether she doesn't. She complains on the one hand that the numbers might be reduced, whereas in fact they're actually being equalised to be fairer, and on the other claims we shouldn't be here at all.
Jessica Morden.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 2, 7 and 13 together. The Government has and is funding a number of rail improvements in Wales, including upgrading Cardiff Central Station and the Cambrian Line, upgrades to key lines in North, South East and South West Wales, which are in the pipeline, and I also recently had the opportunity to visit Pencoed to hear the case for an upgrade to the Pencoed level crossing.
Jessica Morden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Wales accounts for 11% of the rail network, but only receives 2% of rail enhancement funding from this government. So will the UK government commit to addressing this underinvestment and make a start in Newport East by finally allowing the Welsh Government to run more cross-border services under the Wales and Border franchise, and by supporting the new station funds bid for a walkway station for Maida?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this oft-quoted figure actually comes from a Wales Government report which looks purely at renewals between 2011 and 2015. And the very same report on page 20 draws attention to the figure that would apply if one looked at maintenance, operations and restoration as well, in which case the correct figure would be 4.37%, not 1%.
Patricia.
Speaker, I'm glad to hear the Minister mention, in reply to my honourable friend Pencoed in my Ogmore constituency, he will know this debate's been going on now since the early 90s about closing the level crossing. I know he's personally supportive. I know he's been to Pencoed to look at the site. The Bridgend Borough Council has now put forward cabinet reports to say the scheme will cost almost £20 million. DfT ministers cannot keep announcing additional services on the main line without tackling the safety issues around the Pencoed level crossing. So can I press him to ensure that DfT ministers back up their announcements with much needed funding to deal with the problems in my constituency?
Mr. Speaker, I would certainly encourage all partners in this, all stakeholders, including ministers in the DFT, but also in Welsh Government, who are responsible for highways, of course, to engage with the rail network enhancement pipeline in the usual way, or consider future rounds of the Levelling Up Fund. I would say that the honourable gentleman has made a very, very powerful case for that level crossing and the wider strategic benefits that will flow if this problem is sorted out.
Tony Antonio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I know that the Minister shares my disappointment and that of my constituents in Gower about the lack of electrification to Swansea. But is the Minister aware that we have great issues with the attaché carriages and fleet because they are costing a lot of money? And what assessment has he made? Because they are unable to, the cracks that have been caused is because of them becoming hybrid in nature. What confirmation can he give me that he is aware of this problem? What conversations is he having with his colleagues in the Department of Transport? And what is it costing? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe that this problem was actually quite well publicised, so I think we're all aware of it. The rolling stock is being examined. There's no issue around safety. I don't know what the costs are, and I understand the Honourable Lady's disappointment about electrification, but she will know, through her sterling work on the Welsh Affairs Select Committee, that there would have been enormous costs in electrification between Cardiff and Swansea, and no actual benefits for any passengers in terms of decreased time. So what this government wants to do is spend that money where it's going to have the most impact and benefit for rail passengers.
Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The community in St Athan, in my constituency, were naturally disappointed and even angry that the Welsh Government did not include a new station in the application to new stations funds from the Department for Transport. Can my honourable friend reassure me that he will listen to the views of members of Parliament as well as the Welsh Government when considering applications to new stations?
Well, I can absolutely reassure my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, on that particular point, and commend him also for the work he's done in improving rail infrastructure in his own constituency. And I enjoyed visiting Barry Station with him to see the new disability access improvements that had taken place sometime last year.
Michael Fabrica.
When the Minister listed all the projects that the government are undertaking, what he didn't mention was the marvellous work being done by Network Rail on the only wooden bridge in the country being used for rail services between Morfa Mawddach and Barmouth. Will my honourable friend make a point, together with the Secretary of State, of visiting the bridge when it is finally completed and all the wooden piles have been installed, and walk across the bridge, because of course it is a walkway as well as being a railway?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd be delighted to take up the honourable gentleman on what I think is an invitation to a visit. I believe he may even be able to supply a cup of tea somewhere in the vicinity. But he's right, I didn't mention this particular project because there are so many projects I could mention that Network Rail are responsible for in Wales as a result of UK government funding. I also didn't mention the South Wales Relief Line or the North Wales Coastline or the hopeful improvements that will come about to the Wrexham Bidston Line or a whole host of other projects that are being funded by this UK government.
Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One key way we are supporting rail infrastructure across the country is through HS2. Does the Minister agree with me that HS2 will have a truly nationwide benefit in places like Port Talbot and in Teesside if we use UK steel in its construction?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, there'll be many companies in Wales who will be tendering for work on the HS2 project. So, of course, there'll be huge benefits to Wales, huge benefits for the railway industry, and, of course, huge benefits for the whole of the United Kingdom, because HS2 is also about getting people off the roads and onto the railways, which is something that anyone who supports getting Britain to net zero by 2050 should be in support of.
Mr. West.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable lady for that question on manufacturing, and just point out, which is somewhere in here, and assure that the UK government is completely committed to manufacturing in Wales, which is why we have put £3.4 billion, given the £3.4 billion into manufacturing, enable companies to take advantage of the many schemes which were brought forward during the COVID crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that response. Will the Minister join with me in welcoming the Welsh Labour Government's £20 million commitment to the Advanced Manufacturing Research Institute in Broughton, in the constituency of my right honourable friend, the member for Allen and Deeside, which will attract business and boost skills across the North Wales region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that, I believe, would be a promising scheme that could perhaps be looked at in conjunction with the growth deals. As the Honourable Lady will be aware, £790 million has been put forward for growth deals across Wales, and those are exactly the sorts of schemes which are being considered as part of it. And can I say how strongly I welcome the Honourable Lady's support for the aviation sector, which is something I hope will be shared by all of her colleagues.
Question 4, please, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 4 and 10 together. Wales' greenhouse gas emissions have fallen to close to 31% since 1990. To bring them down to zero, we'll be scaling up low-carbon power generation, kick-starting the hydrogen economy and transitioning to zero-emission vehicles.
Grateful for that response. Many parts of Wales are rural, like my own constituency in the Scottish borders. Now, these rural areas need a plentiful supply of electric car charging points to encourage people to make the switch to electric cars. So how is the UK Government supporting the switch across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom?
Well, I'm very grateful for the Honourable Gentleman's question, because it also illustrates a situation very similar to his in Wales. I hope he's as pleased as we are with the commitment to £275 million to the electric vehicle home charging scheme, workplace charging scheme, on-street residential charging scheme, and a number of other measures, all of which, of course, are UK-wide initiatives.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The drive to net zero presents huge challenges to industry all across South Wales, especially for us in Pembrokeshire, where the oil and gas plants support thousands of high-quality jobs. So what further steps can UK Government take to help the energy sector to adapt, taking advantage of new opportunities in hydrogen, but also plans for floating offshore wind? Because the truth is we're going to need significant extra help in Pembrokeshire if we're going to make that transition.
Hear, hear. Well, my right honourable friend raises a very important point. I hope he's taken note of the £20 million commitment to the South Wales Industrial Cluster. That's driving initiatives around carbon capture and similar initiatives. I and he frequently speak to big employers in our area like Valera on the Milford Haven Waterway, which is an absolutely critical part of our net zero ambitions in Wales. And of course, the floating offshore wind opportunities in the Celtic Sea are well known to both of us, and I hope that developers will be able to bid for contracts of difference later this year.
Shadow Minister Gerald Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to tackling climate crisis, I'm sure that the Secretary of State will agree with me that the Welsh Labour Government has led the way, banning fracking, legislating for net zero, establishing a new ministry for climate change and generating more than 50% of the energy we use from renewable sources, a figure higher than the UK average. But does the Secretary of State also agree that these efforts are undermined somewhat by his own government's decision to drop binding commitments on climate change from the free trade deal with Australia? And what message does this send to the world ahead of this country's hosting of the COP26 summit later this year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't acknowledge his challenge in quite the way he would expect me to. I think it's been made perfectly clear that our net zero ambitions aren't going to be solved by one country or one government. It's going to be resolved by a very serious and joined-up approach to net zero across the UK and beyond. I'm very happy, as he knows I am, to work with Welsh Government in achieving those aims. If we relegate this to some kind of political spat, that will make the challenges harder. And so I hope he will join with me and Welsh Government colleagues in trying to make sure that we achieve the mutual aims that we claim to share.
Yes, will the Secretary of State look at the recommendation from the Welsh Affairs Committee that Wales should get its fair share of HS2 funding, the same as Scotland, in order that we can invest in a modern infrastructure and meet net zero, in particular with the Swansea Bay Metro, more quickly?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Gentleman and I share many common ambitions as far as the rail network of Wales is concerned. He knows my views on that. He also knows Union Connectivity Review will be published shortly. I don't want to second-guess what's in that, but I suspect he and I need a conversation shortly after that's been published.
Robin Miller.
Speaker, there's great potential for small-scale renewable energy schemes in the more rural parts of Aberconwy. What discussions has my right honourable friend had to ensure that the grid connections are in place to make these viable?
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's fair to say they're in their early stages. I enjoyed my visit to his constituency last week where these points were raised, but he's right to point out that we can come up with all the initiatives in the world, but unless there is a supportive grid to cope with that, we will be, our progress will be slower than we would like. So those conversations are in play, and I look forward to sharing them with him at the earliest opportunity.
Kevin Braddon.
Chief Pimp, number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 5 and 8 together. My discussions with the First Minister and his ministerial team are focused on how our respective governments can use the powers at our disposal to deliver jobs and economic growth for Wales.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hijacking pots of money for Wales into UK government departments that haven't operated in Wales for 20 years undermines the devolution settlement and, by extension, the union. But just as damaging is the bureaucratic delay caused by the uselessness of UK ministers. Why have Welsh councils still not had a response on community fund renewal projects that are supposed to be completed by March 2022? If he and his ministerial colleagues can't do the business, they should get off the pot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say that in the last 18 months or more, I have spoken to numerous individuals, charities, churches, universities, private and public sector, business, investor, you name them, we've spoken. Not a single one of them has raised the concerns that the Honourable Gentleman raises this morning. They are committed to the economic recovery plans that we're talking about. And as I said in answer to a previous question, if all of these sessions are to relegate these exchanges to some kind of cheap sort of political postcode, we will not make the progress that he seeks.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The landslips in the Rhondda last year sent a shiver down the spine of the Valley's communities, and many of my constituents in Cynnar Valley live in fear of future coal tip disasters. 300 of the 2,000 coal tips in Wales have been classed as having a high risk of endangering life or property. We need to know that they're safe, and UK government has a clear duty to make them safe. So can I please ask the Minister what discussion he has had with the Chancellor of the Exchequer ahead of the forthcoming spending review to ensure that sustainable funding is provided to deal with the legacy of the coal tips?
Well, thank you. I think I caught most of that question, but she will no doubt recall the fact that UK government did put over £30 million into coal tip renewal and coal tip safety issues. It was UK government that joined forces with Welsh Government to make sure that that approach was collegiate and addressed all of the concerns which are raised and those which fall into the devolved space just as much as the reserve space. So I think if she wants an example of UK government and Welsh Government working together and the Treasury picking up the tab, this issue is a perfect example of it.
Greg Williams.
Mr. Speaker, respecting devolution cuts both ways. Recently, the Welsh Government published a written statement on the evolution of the national grid. Very welcome, we need to work together, but clearly the 132 kV lines are UK competence. Can I ask the Secretary of State to pull Ofgem and the operators together to build and evolve the national grid with consensus from the people of Mid Wales?
Well, I can go a little further than that, Mr. Speaker, having spoken to the Business Secretary on this topic only yesterday evening. He raises a very important point, especially around where the devolution settlement sits and where reserve responsibilities sit. I think he's absolutely right to raise that, but it's also fair to say that on an issue of this significance, it will require a UK-wide approach, and of course the views and responsibilities of Welsh Government will be taken very seriously in those discussions.
David Linden.
Mr. Speaker, if the devolution settlement is to work, then the UK government's got to match its rhetoric on the respect agenda. Given that all devolved governments in the UK have asked the UK government to cancel the cut to universal credit, can the Secretary of State say that he made that representation to his cabinet colleagues, or is the post of Secretary of State just entirely redundant?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I barely caught a single word of that, but on the basis that I've heard the honourable gentleman's views on this subject before, I will simply repeat my views, which is over the last, and observations over the last 18 months during the COVID pandemic. There has been, I think, a very analytical look at what works and what doesn't work within the devolution settlement by businesses, employees, wealth creators, investors, universities, churches and members of the public. I have to say that this fixation with the niceties of the devolution settlements are not reflected by what business in Wales is doing for the moment. If by any chance, Mr. Speaker, I have missed the honourable gentleman's question, which by the shaking of his head I suspect I have, we can have a conversation in the tea room later.
Robert Halfon.
6, sir.
Mr. Speaker, we fully support the government's apprentice scheme. We have employed apprentices in the Wales office, and our most recent apprentice has just been promoted.
Right, Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend set out what he's doing to encourage apprenticeships across Wales? Will he ensure that all new jobs offered in the Welsh office are offered as apprenticeships, not just graduate schemes? And will he ensure that the Welsh office meets the public sector target on apprenticeships?
Mr. Speaker, I can assure my honourable friend that we will certainly meet the public sector target. We have been meeting it. We will be taking on further apprentices, and we've just taken on a kickstart worker and somebody from the care leavers scheme.